Pollinators. 90% of flowering plants worldwide depend upon them, and they support the production of 87 of the world's leading food crops. Pollinators are essential to life on Earth. Because they perform an essential ecosystem service, pollination, they underpin healthy diets, they drive biodiversity, and they're essential for healthy ecosystems. Without pollinators, we wouldn't have many of our fruit and vegetables like almonds, avocados, apples, even vegetables like carrots and onions. This presentation is about what each of us can do to help pollinators in their local landscape. Whether you're a large-scale commercial farmer or have a small back garden or terrace, each of us can take simple steps to support pollinators in our environment and help bring back the buzz. To get us started, here is Dr. Anna Karukan. Anna is a botanist and a beekeeper from the Western District of Victoria, and Anna is also a Ween Bee Foundation ambassador.
Welcome everyone to today's presentation here about powerful pollinators. On behalf of the Ween Bee Foundation, I'm excited to share with you, and also on behalf of our project partners, the Powerful Pollinators Project, bringing back the buzz with the Powerful Pollinators Guide. So what is the Powerful Pollinators Guide? Well, it's a powerful resource for you to bring back the buzz. That is, in encouraging and sustaining insect pollinator populations on farms, across agricultural landscapes, and in your backyard and garden. It's about giving you the knowledge and the capacity for creating havens for pollinators in small spaces and across large landscapes. It's about connecting you with your patch or your paddock, your local insect life, and bringing back the buzz by choosing local plants that will support insect pollinators in your area. And in today's presentation, we will be introducing to you the why, the what, and the how, and explaining and sharing key points. Specifically, the importance of pollinators. Why are they so vital? Supporting pollinators. What can we do to encourage and protect insect pollinators? And using the Powerful Pollinators Guide. So how do you go about creating an oasis for pollinators, whether it's on your farm or in your garden? Pollinators literally are the littlest things that run the world. So in the first section of today's presentation, the importance of pollinators, they are the canaries in the coal mine, whether it's in our productive or agricultural environments or our native ecosystems. Honeybees, native bees, and many other insect species provide a wealth of services to enable food production and to support and perpetuate native vegetation communities and habitats in our natural environments. Clearly, pollinators are important. 1 in every 3 bites of food you eat requires a pollinator to bring it to you. And the interconnectedness of insects across our native and productive landscapes is incredibly important. So we'll be sharing with you how to enhance these landscapes and environments to promote insect pollinators. In the context of Australian agriculture, bees, native bees and honeybees are incredibly important. They make a massive contribution to our food and fibre businesses. The value of pollinators can be seen in terms of quantity of production, and it's really apparent in the benefit that they give to food crops and agricultural systems. In this slide, I will be showing you that there are many foods that are highly or totally dependent upon pollinators, such as honeybees, to yield a crop, and those that are somewhat less dependent on pollinators but benefit from their contribution in terms of increased yields. So in the table on the left, you can see that there are many crops that are totally bee dependent, such as almonds and apples, avocados, blueberries, to name a few. There are also crops that are grown for seed production, and examples of that include carrot, celery, and even mustard and onion seeds. Broadacre crops that you may not think of as fruit necessarily, but still develop from a flower, are crops such as canola, which is enhanced by pollinator interaction, and that is grown to produce seed in order to make oil. The massive contribution and economic value of honeybees to Australian agriculture is at least $14.2 billion annually. And that's matched by other insect pollinators and native bees. And if you contrast that to the value of honey and hive products, it's orders of magnitude greater. So you can see that in terms of requiring a pollinator to bring you food, it really is food for thought. The value of pollinators is also very, very clearly indicated in terms of the quality of produce. And it's here where we talk about the degree of pollination that may occur in a flower with or without the contribution of visitation by a pollinator. And it's incomplete pollination versus complete, because it's all about the process of pollination in a flower. So pollination is how flowers are fertilized and become fruits, with the seeds contained in them to grow into the next generation of plants. Optimal pollen deposition gives rise to the best fertilization rates of a flower's ovules or female parts by the pollen grains, which are the male gametes. And this in turn increases seed set and seed quality, and also fruit tissue quantity and quality, because in fruit producing plants, seeds that are produced in the fruit give off hormones that stimulate fruit tissue development. So adequate pollination is needed to set seed and produce high quality marketable fruit. That then commands a higher price at market and also a greater appreciation by the consumer of the perceived appeal and edibility of that fruit. And you can see in this slide that there are a number of images that indicate that concept really clearly. On the left, we have a tomato fruit, and the image above shows a completely pollinated tomato fruit with fully developed seeds, lots of pulp, and nice thick fleshy interior, compared to the somewhat withered and less filled interior of that fruit, of the incompletely pollinated tomato at the bottom. Similarly, in watermelons, which is the images in the center of the screen, the top image shows a completely pollinated watermelon fruit with lots of pips inside and very rich, luscious looking flesh and very visually appealing. Contrast that to the watermelon below, which has a rather insipid looking pale pink flesh that is far less visually attractive and just a lot less appealing as an edible item. Cucumbers are another fruit which develops from a flower that requires pollination. And you can also see in these two images on the right the differences in the quality of the fruit from an incompletely pollinated cucumber to a completely pollinated cucumber flower. There's all sorts of differences in terms of shape, texture, colour of fruits that are fully or incompletely pollinated. And sometimes if flowers are not completely pollinated, it can be due to factors such as too few insects in the environment or stressors or negative effects, such as application of chemicals at inappropriate times that may harm the pollinators. So why bring back the buzz? Well, in a nutshell, pardon the pun, more pollinators mean more pollination services for crops and native flora. And so by understanding the needs of pollinators, our invisible, hardworking workforce, and providing for these needs, insect populations will increase in your environment and be ready to help pollinate your crops and gardens for free.
Thanks, Anna. And now let's hear from Dr. Megan Halcroft. Megan is a science communicator, a farmer, and a native bee specialist from New South Wales. And she's also a Ween Bee Foundation ambassador.
So we need to encourage the bees to come to our gardens and our crops by providing them with flowers. And native bees require native flowers in a lot of cases. So our native bees drive biodiversity because they've evolved with our native flowering plants over millions of years. So over the last 120 million years, Australian flora and native bees have co-evolved. And our iconic eucalypts and other plants in the Myrtaceae family have been evolving together, and they've seen the evolution of bee species that are the most diverse species in the world because of these bowls of nectar that our Myrtaceae flowers contain. Unlike social honeybees and stingless bees, our solitary bees don't need to collect food for a large community. They don't have to pack their shopping bags full of pollen and take it back to the nest. They just need to collect enough pollen to feed one individual bee at a time. So instead of packing pollen into their pollen baskets, they actually pack the pollen into what are called scopal hairs. And you'll see that underneath the body of this bee, she's carrying lots and lots of dry, fluffy pollen. This pollen is easily moved from the scopa to parts of the flower. You'll see this bee, she's foraging on a pea flower, and as she's collecting the nectar, the pollen that is on the anthers underneath her abdomen here are touching on the scopal hairs, and she's able to transfer the pollen that already was on those scopal hairs from the previous flower to the next flower as she forages. This enables cross-pollination from flower to flower and from same plant species, but within the same area. So we have over 2,000 species of native bee in Australia, and a lot of those, not all, but many of them have co-evolved with many of our native flowering plants. These bees are the best pollinators for these species of plant. Because of this, bees drive biodiversity. This bee here is a Lipotrichis, and she is buzz pollinating this Dianella flower. And our ground nesting bees are able to vibrate the anthers, which contain pollen inside little pores, and they have to shake the anthers so vigorously in order to liberate the pollen. And then the bee carries that pollen on her body from flower to flower. This enhances cross-pollination as well. So how do we support our native bees? We need to feed them, and we need to give them a place to nest and reproduce. And we need to practice bee-friendly methods of gardening or crop management. We need to have flowers for nectar, and nectar provides energy. So nectar contains sugars, but it also contains minerals and vitamins, which is very important for the development of the baby bees as they're in the nest. The pollen is the protein source. So our native bees are vegetarian. They have evolved over millennia from wasps that are meat eaters to vegetarian bees, and that's what makes a bee a bee. Bees feed their offspring pollen. And we need to provide seasonal abundance. So we need to plant flowering plants that will provide food resources for our bees and other insect pollinators throughout the year. Bees and pollinators need nectar for energy and pollen for protein. But not only do the flowers provide food for the bees provide a function of pollination for the flowers. So as the bee collects nectar as a food reward, it enhances the transfer of pollen from flower to flower. Honeybees collect pollen and nectar. They will take the pollen and nectar back to their hive, and as a community, they will value add those resources. The pollen is packed away and it has a small amount of nectar which has been added to it to help pack it into its pollen baskets. This nectar enables the pollen to actually ferment slightly in the hive, and that activates yeast development and it value adds the pollen. But nectar is really it's a sugary, watery substance as a nectar, but when the bees dehydrate it, they concentrate all of the sugars and all of the goodness of the vitamins and minerals to enhance the food resources that they are collecting and storing. Dehydrated honey, down to 18% moisture content, will store for a very long period of time, and they found honey in the pharaoh's tombs that was still consumable. Solitary bees don't have a community to help them to dehydrate or to value add their foods. So what the native bees do is they will dehydrate the nectar on the go. This is a bee and she's collected enough nectar to fill her crop. Now what she does is she regurgitates that nectar and she'll pull it in and out of her nectar crop through her mandibles and her tongue. Here we have, this is her tongue, and she's holding the droplet of nectar between her mandibles. She'll work that nectar droplet until it's concentrated enough that she feels that she can then continue to forage and add to that, and then she'll dehydrate it more, and then she'll continue to forage and dehydrate it more until she gets a nectar crop that is filled with more concentrated nutrients and energy for her offspring. She'll then take that back to her nest and she will have a very nutritious food resource for her babies. Solitary bees collect dry pollen. Here we have a blue-banded bee. She's got pollen on her tibial scopa. And here we have a resin bee. She doesn't have a yellow belly. This is a resin bee who's filled her scopal hairs with yellow pollen. She will take that back to her nest, and then she will unpack that pollen and she'll regurgitate the dehydrated nectar, and then she will knead that into nutritious dough and she will provision her nest with that. Here we have the nest of a solitary bee. She's made this bee bread by unpacking the pollen and regurgitating the nectar and then kneading that, and then lays an egg on top. And then eventually the egg hatches and this small grub eats this whole pollen package, and she then continues to develop until she's ready to pupate. Honeybees, solitary bees and social native bees require somewhere to nest where they are protected from the weather and also from predators. Honeybees form colonies in large natural cavities. These are called wild living bees, or if you don't really like them very much, they're called feral bees. Unmanaged bees can be a problem. But managed bees are kept in hives and they are looked after by the beekeeper, and the beekeeper ensures that they are managed and don't swarm unnecessarily. Beekeepers will harvest honey that is contained in comb, which the bees produce from wax that their bodies will secrete. The beekeepers will put in frames in the hive, and this is where the bees will store and dehydrate the nectar into honey, but they'll also rear their brood, which is their babies. So nectar is dehydrated down to 18%, and that's what we call ripe honey, and ripe honey will not ferment. About 30% of our native bees will nest in pre-existing cavities. Here we have a resin bee nesting in a man-made nest, and you can make bee hotels, but in nature, these bees will nest in old borer holes, in rotting wood, between cracks and crevices under bark, and any little refuge that they can find. But this can be mimicked by our building of bee hotels. So what we're doing by providing them a nesting space, whether it be areas on your farm that are already there and you just maintain those areas, don't burn all of the fallen wood. If you're concerned about stock or machinery, you can pile it up into a pile and keep it away from the stock and machinery. And that is then a sanctuary for the bees and other insects and reptiles to hide and nest. And then they can increase their populations within a local area. Here we have a male carpenter bee, saying peekaboo. He's nesting in his favourite space, which is a grass tree spike. So not only do we provide native plants for food resources, but they're also potential nesting spaces as well. And on the right-hand side, you can see some pupae that are inside a grass tree spike. 70% of our bees nest in the ground. They'll dig a burrow, and the burrow may be as shallow as 2 centimetres, or it could be as deep as 3/4 of a metre. This little burrow here is about 3/4 of a metre deep, and it was dug by a 10mm long bee. And these are all the brood cells that she's made, and this is where she rears her babies. It's important to keep these ground nesting bees in mind when we're gardening or performing property management tactics. Some of these bees are only about 5mm long. Some are up to 17mm long, but either way, they're very small little bees. And it's quite difficult for them to dig through heavily mulched areas of the garden. So it's a really good idea just to leave some spaces, about at least a metre square, without mulch or with very little mulch, in order for these bees to be able to access the soil and dig their nests. Of the 2,000 species of native bee in Australia, only about 11 species are highly social, and these are our stingless bees. This bee here is a Tetragonula carbonaria. She's stingless, she's mostly black, and she's only about 4mm long, which means that she can access a lot of very small flowers as well as large flowers. There's 2 genera of stingless bee in Australia. That's Ostroplebia and Tetragonula. They nest in larger cavities than solitary bees, but not as larger cavities as honeybees. They'll nest in hollows in trees, but they can also be managed in hives, similar to honeybees. Stingless bees don't use frames, as honeybee keepers will be able to manage their honeybees with frames. Stingless bees just make these pots. So this is pot honey and pot pollen. And they're much harder to harvest the honey. It can be quite traumatic for the bees, but properly managed hives can have supers on top, just like honeybees. These bees naturally occur as far south as Bega, but then they move up the coast, the east coast, and once the populations that naturally occur get to about Kempsey, they start to then spread west along the top of Australia. So mostly they are warmer climate, at least subtropical and then tropical and arid areas. So unfortunately, those of us who live on the west of the Great Dividing Range or south of Bega, unfortunately we can't keep stingless bees because they just don't have enough warm hours in the day and warm days in the year to collect enough food to store. So if we tried to keep them, they wouldn't survive.
Thanks, Megan. And now back to Anna.
So as part of using the Powerful Pollinators Guide, it's great to understand a bit more about bee-friendly practices and principles and how systems and resources interact in the environment and how you can build upon them in the best way possible to provide basics for bees and other insect pollinators. The starting checklist, if you like, includes providing flowers and habitat, that's a place to live, extending flowering times so that you have literally a smorgasbord of forage across the calendar year. And so you're looking at extending flowering times as often as possible across different species. Providing clean water and a safe water supply for bees and other insects to visit that is separate to water sources that you may need for your house or garden. And if visitation from pollinators causes disruption, it's great to provide a separate water supply. And having an impact on the environment that is as minimal as possible in terms of application of chemical and chemical load in that habitat. So I'll introduce to you some examples of those as we talk through the next few slides, and just give you some more foundation into understanding bee-friendly practices and principles. So in an agricultural and food production context, and this is often across large swathes of local landscapes, when we look at crops and native vegetation and supporting pollinators in these environments, it's important to consider what that landscape looks like. And here in Australia, in the main, some of our crops that require pollinator visitations are grown across large tracts of land in a monocultural setting, so one crop species at a time. And this may be on single farms, or on a particular farm you may have a mix of grazing and cropping systems. Sometimes you might see shelter belts adjacent to paddocks that are planted out with native species or introduced hedging species for shelter and shade for livestock. But these plantings also provide a starting point to build pollinator habitat in those environments, and particularly where it's adjacent to cropping systems where pollinators can be of excellent service. And unless we have these diverse environments either adjacent to or amongst these cropping or grazing areas, then the ability of pollinators to contribute to those systems is limited. So ideally, and you can see this from looking at this slide, there are all sorts of different species types and structures and diversities adjacent to and amongst these cropping systems that you can see here. So there's two distinct crops in the picture on the right, a grain and a broadleaf crop. In the background, there are some trees planted for shade and shelter, some of which are native species. But key to what you can see in this image is the proliferation of various species of wildflowers and herbs that give space and refuge for native pollinators when the crops may or may not be either growing or have been harvested or absent from those systems. So in amongst these areas of wildflowers and diverse habitat, there's places to nest, to take refuge, to feed and to breed. And the photograph on the left shows a bee on a brassica crop, such as a mustard or a canola. And in these species, honeybees particularly are key to enhancing pollination and therefore seed set and yield. So it's all about creating diverse and maximising niches, habitats and places of refuge for pollinators in agricultural systems. And this certainly applies at a smaller scale in urban and city environments as well. In terms of practices that support pollinators, it's useful to think of a hierarchy of considerations that's sometimes called integrated management techniques or integrated pest management, IPM, and think about the actions that you may take in trying to control pests that may be either beneficial to or damaging to pollinators. So the hierarchy of principles and decision making relates to avoiding if it's at all possible, the use of conventional pesticides. And you can see that at the top of the triangle in the diagram. It's best to start with proactive practices, which may be creating enhanced habitats for beneficial bugs and pollinators, practicing various methods of cultivation and weed or pest control that is not chemical based, and also using natural controls such as organically certified products and other biocontrol agents in preference to chemical controls, particularly because a number of chemicals in the insecticide, fungicide and herbicide categories have been demonstrated to be detrimental to beneficial pollinators. And so with those principles in mind, it's time to talk about using the guide and putting some steps in place, understanding those principles and getting into creating your own oasis, whether it's on the farm or in the garden, for pollinators to be the best they can be in your environment. And key to that is a number of understandings that I will introduce you to. First of all, it's about learning about your landscape. There are also benefits to learning and discovering more about your local flora and what grows best and naturally in your area. And then having a think about a calendar year or the steps you'll need to take in order to start sourcing plants and preparing a site or a selection of your garden for planting. And in doing so, bringing back to those practices that support pollinators and staying away from the spray as much as you can to create that beautiful oasis for pollinators. So in learning about your landscape, it's basically saying that all things are connected and that we have species of flora and fauna and areas that are connected or separated in the landscape and patches of habitat that may be high or low in quality and extensive or restricted in quantity. And all those things come together to make up your local landscape, whether it's single trees scattered across a paddock or hundreds of hectares of wet, cool, temperate rainforest, or little strips of remnant grassland and wildflower herb fields along a roadside. It's all part of your local landscape and the flora that make it up and the fauna that live in that native vegetation. So understanding what vegetation types grow in your region is really interesting and really informative in helping you learn what will grow best in your area. And it could be to do with the climate, geology, all sorts of things that define your district or your suburb or your local government area. And that then allows you to see what kind of vegetation grows there. So it could be, as in the image in the upper left of the slide, multi-stemmed eucalypts, characteristic of the Mallee region in, say, northwest Victoria across into southeast South Australia. It could be cool temperate rainforest with big tall eucalypts and mossy paths and tree ferns that you see in the lower left-hand image. And that's very characteristic of a lot of parts of far southern Australia, such as in the Otways or in parts of Western Tasmania. Or it could be sort of an open heathy woodland and characterised by more shrubby, woody plants, including these very elegant and dramatic austral grass trees. So there's all sorts of things that come together in terms of vegetation to characterise your region. And with a good understanding of your native flora, you can also come to learn about the native fauna, specifically the insect populations that call your part of the world home. And there are amazing guides online and books that you can seek out to become a citizen scientist and undertake identification of various bugs and beetles, butterflies, flies, wasps and bees that live in your part of the world, or that are possibly living in your part of the world but haven't been seen for some time, and there's an opportunity to attract them back into your area. And these little winged insects and little creepy crawlies and little critters do best when they can access as much of the local environment as possible. And here's where we talk about patches and connectivity. It's all about joining the dots and making it a happy place for your pollinators to live. And by making different areas as accessible as possible, you're creating great habitat. And it might be that some species of pollinator love little strips of vegetation that they can flit in and out of that has lots of edges so they can access grassland or cropland adjacent and fly back in to these small patches. Or they might like large blocks of vegetation that provides an excellent refuge and protection from predators. And understanding different species' needs is a great way to better design plantings and creating connectivity in your area. And that will then give you the difference between a good habitat and a great habitat for pollinators. To learn to understand your landscape from a quality and quantity point of view, and to put your bee goggles on, so to speak, and see the landscape with a bug's eye view. And a classic way to illustrate this concept is to look at these two pictures here. And the one on the right is quite visually stunning and very engaging and appealing to a human being. And the one on the left, you look at it and you think, oh, it's quite majestic, but it's a bit scruffy and a bit untidy looking, and you sort of literally can't see the wood for the trees. And from a human point of view, we're probably less attracted to that. But in terms of habitation by insects and other native fauna, the environment on the left presents an amazing habitat. It's got a range of vegetation, species types, from ground covers to shrubs to trees. It's got great connectivity and it's not weedy. And from a pollinator point of view, that's great habitat. So sometimes we have to be considerate of not just looking for a nice view, but looking for a good habitat as well. And then when we can connect great habitat together, we not only have quality, but we have quantity in the landscape. And that's awesome, which allows you to create an amazing oasis for pollinators. You will be able to, in using the guide and understanding the principles that we've introduced here today, bring a beautiful rainbow of nectar and pollen forage into your environment that caters for a range of species, allows them to feed and breed and nest and rest in that environment, and do so without the threatening processes of management techniques that may have a negative impact on their survival and their thriving in the landscape. So I very excitedly and enthusiastically invite you to bring back the buzz. Visit the Ween Bee Foundation website and download a free copy of the Powerful Pollinators Guide so that you can be part of bringing back the buzz. And here's a snapshot of what's inside the guide. You can see an amazing front cover that shows a native bee representative of the different regions for which we've produced Powerful Pollinators Guides so far. There are fold-out panels that include how to identify and know your different pollinators, and an amazing species list inside that gives you information about all sorts of locally appropriate native plants from which to select to create your oasis. Everything from the tallest trees to the prettiest wildflowers and the tiniest ground covers, things that flower at different times of the year, whether you're looking for winter colour or a bit of summer sensation, and flowers that are anything from whites and creams through to vibrant purples and hot reds. It's all there. And then on the right-hand side of the fold-out panel, we have the kinds of sites that those species grow best in. Is it a dry patch of soil in full sun, or something that's quite wet and shady? And the different insect pollinators that are likely to visit those particular species of plants, so that if you need to, you can hone in on species to attract certain pollinator species that might need help in your region. So get on board and bring back the buzz. And you can use these guides to help you pick out the right flowers that flower at the right time. And alongside that, clean water for your little bee friends and your insect allies, and some insect hotels or growing and developing vegetation that provides permanent nesting habitat and breeding places for these amazing insects.
We hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and if you'd like to have a planting guide developed for your bioregion, please get in contact by giving us a call or sending us an email.